I am Charlie, seasoned fundraiser, host, and producer of Fixing the Philanthropic Flow, a series powered by IG Advisors where we speak with fundraising and grant making activists who inspire us.
Hi everyone, my name's Emily. I'm the CEO at IG Advisors, and I'm also a very experienced fundraiser turned grant maker turned resource activist.
And we at IG Advisors work with the philanthropy, business, and nonprofit sectors to drive social and environmental change. And today we're going to be speaking with one of our wonderful fundraiser fellows from our Fix the Flow Fellowship, Clare. Clare, would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your fundraising journey so far?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for having me. Yes, so I'm currently the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Fund for Global Human Rights. So we're an intermediary or grant-making organization, meaning that we have to raise our funds in order to disperse our funds. So I head up our team that oversees our relationships with institutional donors, so both foundations and governments, as well as some corporate donors.
Amazing. So, as listeners might know, our Fix the Flow Fellowship is a movement of what we call resource activists. So, I'm interested to hear from you. What led you to make that shift from wanting to just kind of play the fundraising game as it's being played to move towards changing the fundraising game? What made you want to change the way the system works?
Yeah, it's a great question because it has been a journey over the past few years. It really has been this shift in available resources from being unrestricted to highly restricted. So the impact that has had on our work in our organization, but also finding a community of peer fundraisers that are also experiencing these same challenges, right? And wanting to develop a collective voice to share what this really means for us, for our organizations, for the work we do. And also with the strong understanding that these effects are felt even more at the grassroots level. I'm in a peer group with other fundraisers from other global human rights funds. So all of us are trying to mobilize funding in order to get it to grassroots movements. And this shift from unrestricted to restricted means that we can't drive our own agendas all the time. It means the funding is much more burdensome to manage. It's more expensive to manage too. So our operational costs go up. We're also trying to ensure that our own grantees can drive their agendas. So we're doing kind of mental gymnastics, trying to convert what is highly restricted funding into the unrestricted funding that our grantees need to do their own work.
It's interesting to hear you saying how squeezed you are in the middle there, right? Because you're a funder, and I think so often people think of funders as having a lot of freedom, but actually when you're that kind of intermediary funder where you have to both fundraise and grant make, you do get into that kind of pressure of almost trying not to translate some of the restrictions from your other funders onto your grantees. And I think one other thing you said that is really important to highlight is collective voice. I think that's something we hear a lot, is how difficult it actually is to speak out about some of these challenges as an individual organization or as an individual fundraiser, because you're just having to do what you got to do, jump through the hoops you've got to jump through. And so there's often something that can come from speaking in unison with others, or maybe speaking in a slightly anonymized or kind of disaggregated way, saying we're all struggling with this. This is really bad. Like, we need it to change in a way that's not putting any individual organization or person at risk. And so I think that is really powerful. And obviously I've seen you make use of that as part of the fellowship as well, alongside your other peers. So I'm curious, thinking about yourself as a resource activist and some of the actions that you have been taking, what would you say is your resource activism superpower?
Yeah, so I think I'm a people person, and I build relationships pretty easily. And as you likely know, this type of fundraising really is about building relationships. So, both externally, but also internally, because collaboration is key, right? So I need to collaborate across all different teams, and having those strong relationships within my organization also helps. But I think, I'd highlight one other thing. And interestingly enough, I feel like many fundraisers point to something along these lines. I think it's the ability to take really complex information and kind of synthesize it in a way that other people are able to understand, right? So I think that's essentially effective communication, but it's also something about putting a puzzle together, right? So taking many different pieces and putting them together in a way that makes sense. And I think that's also what helps fundraisers find that alignment, right? So when you're speaking with a donor and seemingly there isn't strong alignment, but you keep having the conversation until you do find that mutual interest.
You described it as a puzzle. I often think about it as a like Rubik's Cube, right? You've got the donor's interests, you've got your internal financial mechanisms, you've got the field needs, you've got your own team strengths and capacity, and you've got so many kind of things in there that you can get all muddled up with, or you can make really aligned and really strong. And it's a definite puzzle to figure out. So we've got your superpower. What would you say is your kryptonite as a resource activist? What most holds you back from creating the change that you want to see in the funding system?
Yeah, I think it's like kind of the inability or maybe the challenge to get ahead, right? My fellow Sabina wrote a great piece about fundraisers coming into their power, and maybe pushing back sometimes when funding isn't right or funding conditions aren't right. I loved the piece. I completely agreed with it. And I think what prevents me from being able to do that all the time is that I'm fundraising for the now, not necessarily the future. And so there's a more urgent need. So I think in a perfect world, we'd go into a fiscal year, the budget would be fully covered. We'd be thinking about the future, and we'd have a lot more ability to have those long conversations, or even to just walk away when the funding, doesn't represent the best opportunity.
Thank you so much for sharing and being really honest with that. And you are definitely not alone in navigating that tension between wanting to, accept values aligned funding and create values aligned partnerships, while also thinking about, a very immediate need for that funding, and where you are directing that funding. You mentioned that the relationship based approach that you take is your superpower, right? And I think that goes a long way in creating trust. And you wrote a piece relatively recently for the Chronicle on trust-based philanthropy, where you spoke about the damaging effects of grant-making organisations making sudden strategic shifts, and specifically decisions to wind down funding as well. And I wonder, for those listening, for a donor actively trying to move towards a more collaborative and solidarity-based approach to funding that prioritizes that continuity as well as learning, what would be your recommendations for them? What are the key things they can do to move towards that vision and approach?
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer, as we laid out in the piece, would be to prioritize building these strong relationships. And what we tried to argue is that trust goes in both directions, right? So donors need to trust their grantees, but grantees also need to trust their donors. But the real answer is, of course, it's more complicated. I can point to a couple of key factors that seem to be contributing to some of these decisions. Of course, this won't be holistic, but in many cases, it feels like donors are looking to make more impact, right? And they're also very unsure that the work they're currently funding, that it's leading to the impact they want to see. And related to that is how difficult it is to measure certain types of work, right? So this is where I think these strong relationships can play a role, kind of to find a happy medium, right? I think it's understandable that donors would want to know their investments are leading to the type of change they want to see in the world. And at the same time, we also know that it's difficult to measure certain things, and we don't want to overpromise, or in some cases just try to fill in the log frame to move the proposal forward and make our work fit, when the best way to measure progress. So I think a conversation can help us find this happy medium, common ground, where we can meet the needs on the donor side, and we can also say what's possible on our side. Similar to this would be pivoting from investing in one issue area to another, right? And right now, of course, this is climate, understandably. Climate needs a huge investment, of course. But I think through conversations, we can highlight the intersectional nature of the work that our grantees are doing, and get to a point where maybe we all have a common understanding that it's about finding the most effective groups, the movements doing the most impactful work, but we don't have to define issues. I think what we were trying to say in that piece is, through strong relationships, through open conversations, we can actually address many of these challenges that might push donors to change course. And then I think we also all need to find ways to bring boards into these conversations, because often we're having these conversations, but the decision makers are not in the room. And I think this is another really important element.
Yes, it's super interesting. I'm so glad that you spoke to the different ways that open conversation can lead to that trust, because I think that so often it's not that we're saying we can't measure that, or one day you won't see the impact of your funding or the work that we're doing, but sometimes it's just not necessarily linear, or as you said, sometimes it doesn't fall into certain categories, and kind of just opening up the mindset to understand that there's a journey to go on to get to that point of communicating that impact in some cases is super valuable for people to hear about. Thank you so much for sharing those top tips and recommendations for donors looking to shift towards that vision. Wonderful. So on our Fix the Flow Fellowship, we take you through a collective design process. And in those collective design sessions, we don't just talk about the many things, as we have just spoken about, that are not working in the funding system. But what we aim to do is bring funders and fundraisers together to collectively define that guiding star for what we, dreaming big, what are the top 3 qualities of a funding system that you envision?
Yeah, it's hard to limit it to 3. Of course, this idea of moving toward abundance over scarcity, so that really there would be enough funding available for everyone to do their work. And that would also be related to more collaboration and less competition. I think it's a more effective way to work. It's a happier way to work too. And then, of course, as I touched on earlier, the importance of unrestricted funding. So more funders move toward at least less restricted funding. And the last thing I would say is that donors match their operations with their strategies. We tend to really prioritize strategies. And some donors might have a really thorough collective process where they seek even input and consultation, but they don't adjust their operations accordingly. So I would use like the localization agenda as a great example here. Especially some bilateral donors have developed really great strategies all about prioritizing local actors, but they're unable to shift their own operations. So this ends up getting a lot of funding to a very small number of local groups that actually have the capacity to absorb the funding, but also fundraising teams that can meet all of the due diligence requirements. So I think donors need to take it on themselves more to shift their own operations in order to make sure their strategies are as effective as possible.
I love that. And I think that the challenge is so often that there's a pursuing change in the landscape outside of them. And oftentimes some of those values and things that they're pursuing, or even standards that they're trying to kind of mandate for others, aren't necessarily worked internally and kind of turned around on some of those operational pieces as well. So with the fellowship, we're obviously building this kind of movement for change. We're trying to create these big changes in the landscape. But for listeners who just want to be able to take action right now in their day-to-day and do something that feels achievable and tangible for them, what do you think that fundraisers specifically can start with to be able to be part of that kind of creating a fairer funding system?
Well, I mean, I love this philosophy that you all have of resource activism. I actually think just understanding and embracing this philosophy is a great place to start. For me, it actually felt like the first time someone had articulated the way I really do feel about the work that I do, because it doesn't feel like a traditional fundraising role, because it's so interlinked with the programmatic work we do. So it's not to say that, you have to have that direct link in order to feel like you're a resource activist. But I really like this philosophy and think people could learn about it and embrace it. The other thing, that is important to me is that in all of these conversations, we do include diverse perspectives. I think for so long, it's always been program staff leading most, of these conversations. But I love to see more fundraisers raising their voices. Of course, when we talk about diverse voices, this also means activist voices from the global South. I think it also means operations staff, people working in communications, right? We all have a different role to play in the joint work we're trying to do together. And the last thing I would say is related to the trust-based relationships. having conversations where people really can feel comfortable to open up and talk about the challenges they face, but then to move toward finding pragmatic solutions. This works best in maybe a small group, a closed door type briefing, but often staff from donor organizations might say, yes, I really want to do this. I'm trying to do this. And we are aligned, right? But they're up against internal challenges too. So it's being realistic and trying to find concrete and pragmatic solutions.
I love that you bring it back to that so beautifully to highlight the point that we always try to make, which is that both sides of the coin really do experience similar challenges and face barriers to making progress in the ways that they want to. So just having some degree of realism balanced against the utopian vision sometimes can be really useful and help in understanding that. There are so many things in what you have said that I would love to talk about all day. But for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap us up. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us. Please do stay tuned for more episodes, like, comment and subscribe, and do share this episode with any of your fundraiser or grant maker connections that might need a little bit of sparkle in their journey. You can also apply to join our Fix the Flow Fellowship by clicking the link in the description below and join the movement for change, because together we can fix the flow of resources for good.